Hello, welcome. This is David, and this is the Hypothetic RL podcast. This is the podcast where we look at the events in the history of rugby league. I am not a rugby league historian, as I said in the trailer, but I'm going to do my best to try and guide you through the history of this event that's coming up. There's people who are much better at doing that than I am, so let's do the best we can. What I'm just trying to do is just have a little bit of fun with the history of the game, and in each episode I'll look at a particular event in the history of the game and examine the what-ifs and the could-have-beens. With all that boring bit out of the way, let's find out what we're going to look at today. The date was the 20th of September 1992. The game between St George and Illawarra in the preliminary final of the 1992 Premiership. The game was refereed by the bearded wonder himself, Greg McCallum, and there was 38,928 people there according to Wikipedia. This game was a torrid battle, a tight game, in which Illawarra had many chances to win that game, called back on several occasions for forward passes. They had won previously against St George, and their next opponent would be Brisbane, who they had beaten previous as well. It was a pretty disappointing end to the season for them, and with that out of the way, let's have a look. It's time to rewind and see what would have happened should Illawarra have won that game against St George. As Illawarra would be our eventual winners in this game, let's have a look at what happened to Illawarra in their history leading up to this event. The Illawarra Rugby League made several attempts to enter the competition. The first major attempt was in the 1950s, where they were blocked by the Country Rugby League. Basically, the Country Rugby League wanted to try and stop one of their country powerhouses from entering the Sydney competition, and at that point the CRL was quite powerful, and they blocked Illawarra through their constitution. That was pretty crucial. The next one was in 1967. Illawarra were the team that was going to join Penrith in the New South Wales Rugby League, but they were once again blocked by the CRL, and that meant the Cronulla Sharks joined in 1967. So that's probably another one we can do later on, talking about what if Illawarra had come instead of Cronulla, but that's not what we're talking about today. So basically at that point they'd had two attempts. The third and successful one was in 1982. So Illawarra obviously had been to the competition in 1982. They were expansion team along with Canberra at the time. They struggled. They really struggled up until the early 90s, until Graham Murray came along and turned them around. In 1991 they were one game away from competing in the finals, when another one of our famous referees, Mr. Bill Harrigan, apparently apologised after the game for making a very big blunder. I don't know exactly what happened, but they lost the game. They finished 2 points out of the top five. They had a better for and against than four of the teams in the top five. The only team that had a better for and against them then was Penrith, who eventually won. So it was a season of what could have been. Their only ever trophies, Illawarra, was a trophy at Apex Park in Dubbo, where they won the Tooheys Challenge, the pre-season cup. They beat Brisbane 4-2. No tries, 2-1, and that is basically what brings them up to this event. Oh, and I should say as well that they were victorious against St George 2 weeks earlier in the major semi-final. So this will bring us to St George. How do you talk about the history of St George? I pretty much think you've just got to say 11 in a row. But they hadn't really done very much since. Well, obviously they won other premierships since, but in the years leading up to 1992, they had not done particularly well. They had a grand final appearance in 1985, but this was the start of the St George resurgence, and basically from this point on, they did make another grand final in '96 against Manly. They were relatively strong in the '90s, but not to the extent, obviously, they were previously. St George, very proud club, and obviously historically, very well supported and very successful club. 1992 and '93 were two good chances to take home the premiership. We obviously know that they didn't. We also know Brisbane won both. Dirty bloody Brisbane people. But I'm sure there's some Brisbane fans there. I probably shouldn't say that. But you can't have Queenslanders winning the New South Wales Rugby League. That's not very good. But St George, just not powerful enough, just not strong enough to beat Brisbane on those both occasions. 1992 was the first chance they would have. They obviously weren't successful, and in this game against Illawarra in the preliminary final, they gutsed it out. In the game previous, the week before, they beat Newcastle, another one of the Steel Cities, 3-2. So they didn't score a lot of points in those two finals, and which was one of those things where you basically just got to win the game. So they were successful enough; they won those games, and it was leading us up to the point we're up to now. So we're going to talk about the 20th September 1992. What we're particularly going to talk about is it doesn't matter how it happened, but if Illawarra had won that game, what would have happened on the next week in the grand final, Illawarra against Brisbane, and what possibly could have happened to the Illawarra club and the St George club based off what has happened in the present time and based off what would have happened because of that victory by Illawarra. So I think that's got us back up to where we need to be. Fast forward ourselves back up to 1992. Okay, history out of the way, which is good. I'm not the best of historians. I'm reading things off bits of paper. I'm doing the best I can. So let's have a look at 1992. So let's say Illawarra win 6-4. I don't know why 6-4, just because I read that they had a few forward passes go back, and if they score under the post, it's 6-4. So let's say 20th September 1992, Illawarra 6, St George 4. So the next weekend, the grand final, Brisbane looking for their first premiership, Illawarra looking for their first premiership. Would have been a very exciting week. It's very hard to tell what would have happened, but let's have a look at some options. So obviously, Illawarra win means that Illawarra's first and only premiership. Well, assuming they don't go and win more because they've won this, but Illawarra win this premiership and Brisbane have to wait another year. That's certainly an option. That's something that may have happened. Another option might be that Brisbane win and Illawarra make one grand final. So their silverware remains at that one Tooheys Challenge Cup, which is the pre-season cup they won 4-2 against Brisbane. And that's the only grand final they reach. They don't do anything else. Or perhaps reaching this grand final and getting past St George means that in a 1993 season they may have come back, they might have done a lot better. It's probably unlikely, but that's obviously another thing that could happen there. So I suppose the main thing about this is that if Illawarra go through, beat St George and get to this grand final and don't do anything else, then it doesn't really affect the history at all. I mean, it means that there's a runners-up for Illawarra and there's one less runners-up for St George, but at the end of the day no one really cares who finished second, so it's not going to really make much of a difference. So I think just for, I don't know why, I just feel like it might be a better thing to do would be to say, Illawarra's confidence from beating St George twice and their confidence from winning against Brisbane in a pre-season competition is enough for them to reverse what happened in the major semi-final in the game they played against Brisbane 2 weeks earlier, and Illawarra win the grand final. And Illawarra go home to a hero's welcome. They're the first of the two steel towns. They beat Newcastle to the punch and they win a premiership first. They win in 1992. So if that is what happens, then what would happen after that? Would they do anything in 1993? They didn't have a very good year in 93, so it's probably unlikely. They probably still fade in the same way they did through the 90s. They basically, once they lost their coach in 95, they lost Graham Murray, did not do too well. But, I think that you end up with one premiership in 17 years, that's pretty good. As a Parramatta fan, one in 30-something years would be pretty good. But, being a team that actually wins a premiership would be pretty exciting. I don't think it affects them in the whole Super League thing. If you want to know more about Super League, obviously listen to one of my favourite podcasts, Rugby League Digest. And they're obviously going to talk about Illawarra, and they'll talk about what happened and the machinations of teams and mergers. I just think that with Cronulla and St George around, Illawarra were never really going to survive on their own. It didn't really matter what happened. So it looks like you have a team that comes in 1982, wins 10 years later in 1992, and then is basically absolved into, well, not absolved, but is basically joint in a merger with the team that they beat in this hypothetical with St George and in 99, and they remain the one sole premiership for the Illawarra club. I don't know how that affects the St George Illawarra premiership tally, because I'm not sure how they do that. I think St George Illawarra is counted as all the St George premierships and the one St George Illawarra premiership, so do they get one extra? I think that's probably what happens, but probably muddies up the history a little bit. But it would certainly be very interesting to see what would have happened in the Illawarra region should they have won. Would they have had greater attendances? It's sort of impossible to know, but I mean, looking at this how it is, I believe that what we do is we update the tally of premierships. Brisbane lose one, Illawarra gain one, and what it really does do is that ridiculous thing that Ray Warren used to say in the early 2000s, right up till the Roosters won those two in a row recently, is the first team to go back to back in a joint competition. We don't have to hear any of that bloody first team and joint competition Brisbane thing. Well, we maybe do, because we probably have to hear the first team go back to back in the joint competition is going to be Canberra, which is obviously something different. So we'd probably hear about Canberra in 89-90 rather than hearing about Brisbane in 92-93, which is, I think that's a stupid thing to say anyway. But that's probably the only major thing that happens in the most recent history. I don't think anyone's going to go back to 1992 and go, hey, remember when Illawarra won in 1992? Wasn't that so exciting? And it's not going to really affect the game that much. All right, well, thanks very much for listening to me. I hope I haven't prattled on too long, and I hope you enjoyed the premise and everything, and we'll see what I'm going to come up with next week. Or not next week, I'm not doing it every week, but next time. All right, well, thank you, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.